Right now, if you get a cut on your hand, you probably clean it, maybe put on some antiseptic and know exactly why you're doing it. There are invisible organisms out there that can kill you if you don't. Your ancestors had none of that knowledge. No microscopes, no germ theory, no idea that a world of invisible killers existed on every surface they touched. And yet, somehow, humanity survived plagues, wounds, childbirth, and rotting food for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone had the slightest idea what a bacterium was. That shouldn't have been possible. A species that doesn't understand its biggest silent killer should have been wiped out by it. But it wasn't, because it turns out you don't need to understand germs to fight them. You just need to survive long enough to notice patterns. And early humans noticed a lot more than we usually give them credit for. Instinct before understanding. Long before medicine existed, disease avoidance was already built into the human brain. Psychologists call this the behavioral immune system, an evolved set of instincts that make people react to signs of sickness the same way they'd react to a physical threat. Discolored skin, open wounds, the smell of decay, unusual coughing. These triggered disgust, and disgust made people back away. Not because they understood contagion, but because avoiding those triggers kept the ancestors who felt disgust alive, while the ones who didn't feel it didn't survive to pass that trait on. In 2011, a study published in Psychological Science found that disgust sensitivity spikes dramatically around anything associated with infection. Spoiled food, bodily fluids, open sores, far more than it does around things that are simply dangerous but not infectious. That's not a coincidence. That's evolution quietly running an epidemiology program millions of years before anyone knew what epidemiology was. The first quarantines. You'd think quarantine in any formal sense is a modern invention. It isn't. The word itself comes from the Venetian quaranta giorni, 40 days. The length of time ships were forced to wait offshore before docking during the plague years, because sailors had noticed something. Sickness seemed to travel with people, and waiting seemed to stop it. But that instinct is far older than Venice. Leviticus, written over 2,000 years ago, contains detailed instructions for isolating people with skin diseases outside the camp until symptoms cleared. Ancient Chinese medical texts from as early as 1000 BCE describe separating the sick from the healthy during epidemics. None of these cultures knew what a virus or bacterium was, but they knew through generations of painful trial and error that proximity to the sick meant more people got sick. That's not modern science. That's applied observation, refined over centuries into something that worked, even without a mechanism to explain why. Wound care without antibiotics. Here's where it gets stranger. In 2015, researchers at Swansea University tested a 1,000-year-old Anglo-Saxon remedy for eye infections, found in a manuscript called Bald's Leech Book. The recipe called for garlic, onion, wine, and bile from a cow's stomach, aged in a brass vessel for 9 days. When microbiologists actually made the remedy exactly as written and tested it, it killed methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, one of the most dangerous antibiotic-resistant bacteria in modern hospitals. A 1,000-year-old recipe, written by people who had no concept of bacteria, outperformed some modern treatments against a superbug. Nobody who wrote that recipe knew why it worked. They just knew from repeated experience that it did. And it's not an isolated case. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe applying moldy bread directly to wounds. For most of history, that sounds like folk superstition. Except mold produces antibiotic compounds. The same basic principle behind penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928 by complete accident when a mold spore contaminated one of his petri dishes. Ancient Egyptians had stumbled onto the same basic chemistry 3,000 years earlier, purely through observation. Wounds treated with certain molds healed, wounds that weren't didn't. Honey, salt, and the chemistry. Nobody understood. Honey shows up constantly in ancient wound treatment, from Egypt to Greece to India. Modern microbiology explains exactly why. Honey has extremely low water content and high acidity, which makes it almost impossible for most bacteria to survive in it. It also produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide as an enzymatic byproduct. None of the people using it knew any of that. They just noticed that wounds packed with honey didn't rot the way untreated wounds did, and they kept doing it, generation after generation, purely because it worked. Salt followed the same pattern. Salting wounds, salting meat, salting fish, all instinctively discovered methods of pulling water out of environments that bacteria need to survive in. Nobody in ancient Mesopotamia knew what osmosis was. They just knew that salted meat didn't spoil the way fresh meat, and that was enough of a reason to keep doing it for thousands of years. The role of religion and ritual. A huge amount of what looks like religious ritual to us now was, functionally, disease control. Ritual hand-washing appears independently in Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and multiple other traditions, almost always tied to specific triggers. After touching the dead, after using the toilet, before eating. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were behavioral patterns that happened to reduce disease transmission, wrapped in religious authority, because religious authority was the only mechanism ancient societies had for enforcing a rule at scale, across generations, without anyone understanding the biological reason behind it. Historian and physician Sheldon Watts has argued that many purity laws across ancient religions functioned as de facto public health codes, rules that worked whether or not anyone believed the stated spiritual reasoning, because the actual behavior being enforced happened to interrupt disease transmission. In other words, you didn't need to believe in germs. You just needed to believe you'd be spiritually unclean if you skipped the hand washing, and the outcome was identical either way. Burying the dead, burning the sick. Even burial practices carried an unintentional public health function. Across dozens of unrelated cultures, bodies of plague victims were burned rather than buried, or buried unusually deep, or moved far outside settlements. Practices historians now recognize as effective, if accidental, containment strategies. During the Black Death in the 14th century, some Italian cities began requiring gravediggers to work at night and avoid the crowded parts of town, a policy that had nothing to do with germ theory. Europeans wouldn't understand contagion in a scientific sense for another 500 years, and everything to do with a grim pattern recognition. Fewer people near the bodies meant fewer new cases when instinct failed. It's worth being honest here, this system was far from perfect. For every honey and wound success story, there were centuries of ancient medicine that did real harm. Bloodletting, drinking mercury as medicine, blaming disease on bad smells or divine punishment rather than contagion at all. The same societies that accidentally discovered antibiotic mold also burned supposed plague spreaders alive during outbreaks, believing disease was caused by malicious magic rather than biology. Trial and error is not the same as understanding, and for every remedy that worked, there were dozens that didn't, and people paid for those mistakes with their lives. But here's the part that matters. Even flawed, half-superstitious systems built entirely on pattern recognition were enough to keep the species alive long enough to eventually build real medicine on top of them. So here's the whole arc. Long before written history, disgust and instinct were already functioning as an invisible immune system, keeping people away from the sick without anyone understanding why. Thousands of years ago, cultures across the world independently discovered quarantine without any concept of a virus. 1,000 years ago, an Anglo-Saxon remedy accidentally created something that still kills modern superbugs. 3,000 years before Alexander Fleming, Egyptians were applying mold to wounds because it worked, not because they understood penicillin. And for most of human history, religious ritual was quietly functioning as public health law, enforced by faith instead of science, but producing the same result either way. None of these people ever saw a bacterium. They never knew what a virus was, or what an antibody did, or why washing your hands mattered biologically instead of spiritually. And yet, generation after generation, they built an entire invisible defense system out of nothing but careful observation and painful trial and error. noticing what worked, repeating it, and passing it down long enough for someone, eventually, to finally look through a microscope and understand why. You don't need to see the enemy to learn how to survive it. Humanity proved that 100,000 years before we ever had the tools to prove it scientifically.